The forge burned at midnight, not the slow, patient burn of a well-fed hearth, not the orange glow that had lived inside the stone walls for 6 years, shaping iron into blades and blades into bread money. This was a different fire, a hungry one. It climbed the timber frame like something with hands peeling back the bark in long, curling strips that turned to ash before they hit the ground. The roof went first, then the bellows, then the shelving where 60 knives had once hung, waiting for buyers who came less and less often. 3 men stood in the yard, each at a separate corner like points of a broken triangle. None of them moved toward the water trough. None of them grabbed the buckets hanging by the well. They stood and they watched, but they were not watching the fire. They were watching each other. Bridger Sutcliffe, the eldest, at 34, stood closest to the cabin. His spectacles reflected the flames in 2 small orange discs, and his hands hung at his sides, trembling. Not from cold, not from shock. His hands had been trembling for 8 months, and tonight was simply the first night the fire was bright enough for anyone to notice. Thane Sutcliffe, the middle brother, at 28, stood nearest the tree line. He had arrived only minutes ago, his horse still breathing hard from the ride up from Copper Falls. His boots were muddy, his coat was buttoned wrong, and he stood 3 seconds longer than either of his brothers before he moved at all. 3 seconds. It does not sound like much. But when a man's home is burning and he stands still for 3 full seconds while his brothers stand still too, those seconds carry the weight of something that has nothing to do with fire. Duff Sutcliffe, the youngest at 22, stood by the woodpile. His hands were ink-stained as they always were, and his eyes moved from Bridger to Thane and back again with the careful precision of someone who had spent his whole life watching his older brothers and cataloging what he saw. None of them spoke. The fire spoke for them, cracking and popping and sending sparks into the Montana sky like a congregation of small, desperate prayers. Then from the darkness behind the cabin, a woman stepped into the light. She was not what you would expect. Not out here, not at this hour, not in this country. She wore leather trousers and a man's linen shirt and a blacksmith's apron that was too heavy for a body her size, though her body was not small. Her shoulders were broader than most women's. Her hands were thick with calluses mapped with small white scars from a decade of forge burns. Her hair was red, dark red, the color of old copper left out in rain, and it had come loose from its tie and hung wild around a face that was not looking in at the fire. She was looking at the 3 men who were not fighting it. In her right hand, she held a bucket of water. In her left, she held a blacksmith's hammer with an oak handle worn smooth by a grip that was not hers. It had been her father's. It was the only thing she had carried from Pennsylvania, and it was the only thing she would carry out of tonight. Her name was Rowena Kilbride, and she had not come to Montana to be anyone's wife. "Whoever set this fire knows who they are," she said. Her voice cut through the sound of burning timber the way a blade cuts through rope, clean and with no wasted motion. "But the tools inside that forge are mine, and I am not standing here watching 3 grown men measure which of them looks most guilty." She threw the water into the flames, 1 bucket. It hissed and vanished into steam. She turned back to the well without waiting. Duff moved first. He grabbed a bucket and ran to the trough. No hesitation, no words. Then Bridger. Slower because his hands would not stop shaking, but he moved. Thane stood for 3 more seconds, watching the woman, watching his brothers. Then he moved too. But those seconds, those 3 plus 3 seconds of stillness while the forge burned. Rowena would remember them. So would the others. And when the truth came out as truths do in small places, where men keep large secrets, those seconds would matter more than anyone standing in that yard could know. They fought the fire until dawn. It was not enough. By the time the sun crested the Bitterroot Peaks and poured thin winter light across the yard, the forge was gone. The timber frame had collapsed into a heap of charcoal and bent nails. The stone walls stood like broken teeth. The anvil, too heavy to burn, sat in the center of the wreckage like a headstone for everything the 3 brothers had built in 6 years. 4 people sat on a fallen log in the yard. Between them on the ground sat a cracked copper coffee pot, a Damascus blade with a rippled steel pattern that caught the morning light, and the hammer with the oak handle. These were the things Rowena had saved from the fire. The coffee pot because it was the closest thing to her hand when the roof came down. The blade because a smith saves blades the way a sailor saves compass and rope by instinct without thinking, because thinking takes too long, and the hammer because it was her father and she would sooner lose her own hand than leave it behind. She poured coffee from the cracked pot. She handed the first cup to Bridger. Not because he was the eldest, not because she respected him more than the others. Because she had seen his hands shaking, and she had watched him hold the bucket with both palms wrapped around the handle like a man holding a prayer book in a language he could no longer read. She did not know why his hands trembled. Not yet, but she noticed, and she remembered. While the others sat staring at the remains of their livelihood, Rowena crouched near the edge of the foundation. Something in the mud had caught her eye. Boot prints, not the flat-soled leather boots that blacksmiths wore. These prints were made by hobnailed boots, the kind that miners wore with steel studs pressed into the soles to grip wet rock. The prints were large, size 12 at least. No one in this yard wore hobnailed boots. No one in this yard had feet that size. She studied the prints for a long moment. Then she stood up. She said nothing. She tucked the information away, the same way she tucked her father's hammer back into her belt, carefully, firmly, and without anyone seeing exactly where she put it. The silence after a fire is not the same as ordinary silence. It has texture. It has weight. It sits on your shoulders like a coat made of wet wool, and it presses down until someone speaks, or someone leaves, or someone breaks something just to hear a different sound. 4 people sat in that silence, and each of them carried a thing they were not saying, and the total weight of those unsaid things was heavier than the collapsed roof behind them. 5 weeks earlier, when she had not yet learned their names, when she had nothing but one line in a crumpled newspaper and a hammer that weighed as much as everything she owned. One line, 1,800 miles. That is where this story begins. The stagecoach dropped her at the bottom of a dirt track that wound up into the mountains like a scar on the landscape. Bitterroot Range, Montana Territory. November, the air tasted like pine sap and distance. The driver looked at her as she jumped down, looked at the hammer on her hip, looked at the leather trousers in the absence of a trunk or a hat box or any of the things a woman traveling alone across the country was expected to carry, and he decided not to ask. Smart man. She had one bag. Canvas, not leather, patched at the bottom with a square of old sail canvas she had traded for in St. Louis. Inside, a rolled blacksmith's apron, a change of shirt, a whetstone, and the stub of a pencil she used for marking steel. No dress, no ribbon, no mirror. On her hip, the hammer. 3.5 pounds of forged steel on an oak handle that had been shaped by 20 years of her father's grip until the wood had memorized the exact curve of his palm. She could feel the ghost of his hand every time she picked it up. Wanted blacksmith with specialized technique. Sutcliffe Forge, Bitterroot Range, Montana Territory. One line. She had read it in the Pittsburgh Dispatch while eating the last meal she could afford in a boarding house that was about to evict her for the 3rd time. One line, and she had written a letter that same night, and she had sold her father's spare tongs to buy the stagecoach fare, and she had crossed a continent because that one line said specialized technique, and she knew only a handful of people in this country who could do what she could do with 2 kinds of steel in a patient fire. The man waiting at the top of the track was not what she expected. He was young, 22, though she would not learn that until later. Short for a man with dirty blonde hair and hands that were small but precise. Craftsman's hands. She could see it in the way he stood weight-balanced, fingers slightly curled, the posture of someone who spent their days shaping things smaller than themselves. Ink stains on his right index and middle finger. Not forge ink, writing ink. He looked at her, then at the hammer on her hip, then at her hands, and she saw his eyes pause on the calluses and the burn scars, and she saw him recalculate everything he had assumed about the person stepping off that coach. My brother said the blacksmith would be arriving today. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they are choosing each word from a limited supply. He did not say the blacksmith would be a woman. Your brother hired a technique, not a gender. She picked up her bag before he could reach for it. I have the technique. You have the forge. That is enough. His name was Duff. She would learn the rest later. He led her up the track without another word, and she noticed that he walked the way she walked, eyes on the ground, reading the terrain, cataloging the mud and the rocks and the angle of the slope, the way a smith reads the color of heated steel. He was paying attention. She respected that. Most people did not pay enough attention to the ground beneath their feet. The forge sat in a clearing halfway up the mountain. A stone building with a timber roof, a wide door that faced east to catch the morning light, and a chimney that rose crookedly from the back wall, leaning about 4 inches to the left. She saw the lean before she saw anything else, the way a doctor sees a limp before he sees the patient's face. A man stood in the doorway, tall, thin in a way that suggested he had once been less thin, with blue-gray eyes that squinted against the afternoon light. His beard was short and unkempt. His hair, dark brown, had gone gray at the temples in a way that usually takes a decade longer than his 34 years should have allowed. He wore spectacles, wire-rimmed, and he adjusted them twice in the time it took her to walk from the tree line to the door. He did not see her clearly until she was 10 feet away. She would not understand why until 6 days later. But she noticed the squinting, the head tilt, the way he turned his left ear toward her before his eyes found her face. She noticed, and she filed it away beside the hobnailed boot prints and the cracked coffee pot in the growing catalog of things she noticed that other people did not. "I did not advertise for a wife," he said. His voice was deep and very tired. "Good, because I did not come to be one." She walked past him into the forge. "Show me the hearth." She did not wait for him to show her. She walked to the hearth herself, and her hands went to the stone walls the way a blind person's hands go to a familiar doorframe. She touched the fire bricks. She felt the temperature gradient, the subtle difference between the bricks that had been properly cured and the ones that had cracked from thermal stress. She looked at the flue. She tapped the anvil with her knuckle and listened to the ring the way her father had taught her, reading the metal's health through sound. She checked the air vent. She examined the bellows. She picked up a piece of slag from the floor and rolled it between her fingers, feeling the texture, identifying the type of coal that had produced it. Bridger Sutcliffe stood in his own doorway and watched a stranger examine his forge with the eyes of someone who understood it better than he did. He had not experienced this before. People came to his forge to buy knives or to watch him work with the cautious fascination that fire always inspired in people who did not work with it. No one had ever walked in and started diagnosing the place the way a horse doctor walks around a lame mare, pressing here, tapping there, already knowing what is wrong before anyone asks. She turned back to face him. "The flue is misaligned 4 inches to the left. Your heat distribution is uneven, which means anything you forge on the right side of the anvil is getting 20% less radiant heat than the left. The anvil itself has a hairline fracture on the right horn, and someone has been using bitumenite coal instead of oak charcoal. This hearth was built for charcoal heat. Bitumenite burns 60 degrees hotter and twice as acidic. Your fire bricks will crack from the inside out within a year." Silence. Bridger looked at Duff. Duff looked at Bridger. 6 years they had worked this forge, and in 90 seconds, a woman with red hair and a dead man's hammer had identified 3 problems they had either missed or chosen not to see. The misaligned flue, which explained the uneven tempering that had ruined a batch of skinning knives last month. The cracked anvil horn, which Bridger had been compensating for by shifting his striking angle without telling anyone why. The wrong coal, which Thane had started buying because it was cheaper, and Thane always chose cheaper. Before either of them could respond, a third figure appeared in the doorway. He came from the direction of the trail, not the cabin, and his clothes were cleaner than his brother's clothes, which was unusual for a man who was supposed to spend his days in a forge. He was the best looking of the 3, and he knew it. Wavy hair a shade lighter than Bridger's green eyes, and a smile that arrived on his face before the rest of his expression had decided what it was doing. "Well," he leaned against the doorframe, "are we hiring a smith or a beauty queen?" Rowena did not look up from the anvil she was still examining. "Give me your hand," she said, holding hands already. "Give me your hand." Thane extended his right hand with the easy grin of a man who was used to charming his way past things. She took it, turned it over, studied his palm with the same focused attention she had given the fire bricks in the flue. His palm was smooth. No calluses, no burn marks, no hammer scars, no heat blisters, no forge dust embedded in the creases. This was not the hand of a man who worked steel. This was the hand of a man who shuffled cards and counted coins and shook other men's hands across saloon tables. "You are not a blacksmith," she said. "What do you do here?" Thane pulled his hand back. His grin stayed, but something behind it shifted the way a picture on a wall shifts when someone slams a door in the next room. Duff turned his face away to hide a smile. the first genuine amusement she had seen from the youngest brother. And Bridger, standing in the doorway with his squinting eyes and his trembling hands, did something she had not expected. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely, just enough, almost a smile. It did not last. Whatever weight he carried pushed it back down. But she saw it, and she would remember it later when she understood what it cost a man like Bridger Sutcliffe to almost smile. She gave them the terms that same evening. The four of them sat at the plank table in the cabin, eating beans and salt pork that Duff had cooked without complaint or flair. The cabin was clean but sparse. 3 bunks along the back wall, a wood stove, a single window facing the forge. Rowena sat on a stool they had brought from the workshop, and she ate with the efficient focus of someone who treated meals the way she treated forge work necessary, not recreational. 7 days, she said. Give me 7 days. If I cannot forge a Damascus blade from your hearth in 7 days, I leave. No wages. Bridger studied her across the table. She could feel him calculating, weighing the offer against the risk, measuring her the way he would measure a piece of steel before committing it to the fire. He looked at Duff. Duff nodded. Thane shrugged. 7 days, no cost, nothing to lose. Rowena looked at him. Her eyes were amber brown, the color of good whiskey, held up to firelight, and they had the same effect. They burned. There is a cost. For 7 days I give the orders in that forge. No one touches steel unless I say. No one fires the hearth unless I say. No one swings a hammer unless I say. Thane's shrug lost some of its ease. Bridger kept his eyes on her for a long moment, and she held his gaze the way you hold a piece of hot steel firmly without flinching, knowing that flinching would ruin the work. 7 days, Bridger said. Day 1 she tore the forge apart. Not literally, though it felt that way to 3 men who had built it with their own hands over a period of years. She made them disassemble the flue and rebuild it at the correct angle using a plumb line she fashioned from a piece of string and a nail. She made them replace the cracked fire bricks on the right side with spare bricks from the pile behind the cabin. She made them clean out the coal bin and switch back to oak charcoal, which meant Duff had to ride to Elspeth Cork's general store at the base of the mountain to buy 3 sacks of the stuff, which cost twice as much as the bitumenite coal Thane had been purchasing. She is impossible, Thane muttered, while lifting a 50-pound fire brick into position. Duff, holding the other end, answered with the flat honesty that was his only mode of communication. She is right. That is what makes it impossible. Rowena heard them both. She did not respond. She was measuring the flue angle with her arm span, calculating the correction needed, and she did not have time for commentary on her personality from men who had been burning the wrong coal for 2 years. She explained things only to Duff because Duff asked. And Duff asked because he wanted to understand, not because he wanted to challenge. When she explained why the misaligned flue mattered, she spoke in the language of the craft, not the language of lectures. Heat rises and follows the path of least resistance. A flue tilted 4 inches left means the hot air escapes unevenly. One side of the forge runs hotter than the other. Forging on uneven heat is like walking with a limp. You can get where you are going to, but you will never run. Duff listened. He remembered. She respected that too. Day 2 she went to choose steel, and she found 2 things she was not looking for. She and Duff walked to the materials shed behind the forge where the Sutcliffes kept their stock of iron bar and scrap steel. She taught him how to identify the 2 types of steel needed for Damascus work by sound. Listen. She struck a piece of high-carbon steel with the back of a file. The metal sang a clear high note that hung in the cold air. High carbon. It rings like a church bell, holds an edge like nothing else but brittle. Drop it wrong and it snaps. She struck a second bar. This one produced a duller sound, shorter without resonance. Mild steel, tougher, more forgiving, but it will not hold an edge. You need both. He asked about her father. She answered the way she answered everything, straight, short, no decoration. My father forged blades for 40 years. He died of black lung from breathing forged smoke. I inherited his hammer. I did not inherit his lungs. She said it the way a woman reads a price list. Flat. No extra emotion. But her hand tightened on the hammer handle, and Duff saw it, and he added that detail to the long list of things he observed and did not mention. Later that morning, she went to Duff's work area to borrow a pair of cutting tongs. His workspace was the tidiest corner of the forge. A small drafting table pushed against the wall where he kept his sketches and his inks and the tools he used for the fine detail work that separated a Sutcliffe blade from a common knife. On the table beside a half-finished sketch of a blade design lay an opened envelope. The letterhead was printed in clean-type Bozeman printing works. She did not pick it up. She did not read the contents. She did not need to. The name of the company and the fact that the envelope was opened and kept told her everything she needed to know. The youngest brother had options elsewhere, and he was considering them. She took the tongs. She left the envelope where it was. She added it to the catalog. That afternoon, she went to Elspeth Cork's store to buy fire clay for the hearth repairs. The store was a single-room building at the bottom of the mountain trail, stocked with everything from flour to fence wire. Behind the counter stood a woman of 60 with white hair pinned high, a clean apron, and eyes that missed nothing. She watched Rowena enter. She watched Rowena's hands on the counter. Specifically, she watched the calluses. It has been a long time since I have seen forged hands walk into this store. The old woman's voice was dry and precise, like well-cured wood. The last was Bridger Sutcliffe, but he has not come in for some time now. Rowena looked at her. You know the Sutcliffes. 6 years. Bridger used to come every 2 weeks for supplies. Charcoal, fire clay, wax candles. She paused. Lately I deliver to them. It is on my way. It was not on her way. The mountain trail added 2 hours to any delivery route. Rowena did not point this out, but she noticed something on the shelf behind the counter. Candles, not the usual stock a general store would carry. There were dozens of them, thick pillar candles and tapers stacked in rows that took up an entire shelf. More candles than a store this size would sell in a month. She did not ask why, but the image stayed with her. It would connect to other images later the way the pieces of a Damascus blade connect to each other during the folding process layer by layer, invisible at first until the pattern reveals itself. Day 3, she forged for the first time in the Sutcliffe hearth. She stood before the anvil with her father's hammer in her right hand and a bar of high-carbon steel and the tongs in her left. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow, exposing the network of small white scars on her forearms, the history of 10 years written in healed burns. She did not roll her sleeves for effect. She rolled them because loose fabric near a forge fire was a good way to lose an arm. Bridger stood closer than he had stood on previous days. He wanted to watch her work. She could feel his attention like heat from the forge, focused and steady. But she also noticed the squinting. The way he tilted his head to the left, searching for an angle that gave him better clarity. The way he leaned forward when she placed the steel in the fire, as if proximity could compensate for something that distance could not. She did not know what was wrong with his eyes. Not yet. But she was building a theory, the way a smith builds a blade, one observation at a time, each one folded into the next. She heated the steel to cherry red. She brought it to the anvil. She swung. The sound of a hammer on hot steel is not like any other sound. It has a specific pitch, a bright, sharp ring that changes depending on the temperature of the metal, the angle of the strike, and the mass of the hammer. A good smith can hear the steel's readiness, the way a musician hears a note, too cold, and the ring is dull, reluctant. Too hot, and it screams. Rowena's steel sang. Each strike landed precisely. Not too hard, not too soft. No wasted energy, no corrections, no second swings. The hammer rose and fell with the mechanical grace of something that had been practiced 10,000 times until it stopped being practice and became instinct. Bridger watched, but he was not watching the steel. He was watching her arm, the muscles in her forearm, contracting and releasing with each swing the way her shoulder rotated to distribute the impact, the economy of movement that separated a competent smith from a gifted one. He knew what he was seeing. He had been good enough once to recognize mastery when it stood in front of him. He had also been good enough to know that he could no longer do what she was doing. Not because he lacked strength or technique, because he could no longer see the color of the steel in the fire. Cherry red and white hot looked the same to him now, a blurred orange glow with no gradations, no information, no language. The steel had stopped speaking to him in a dialect he could understand. At the end of the day, while the others were cleaning up, Duff was sweeping the yard outside the forge when he saw something that made him stop. A man on horseback was riding slowly along the trail that led past the Sutcliffe property. The man was not anyone Duff recognized. He wore a long coat dark and his boots in the stirrups were hobnailed. Miner's boots. Not the boots of a rancher or a trapper or a smith, He stopped his horse near the property line. He looked at the forge. He looked at the sign that read Sutcliffe Brothers Forge. He looked around the yard slowly the way a man looks at a room he is measuring. Then he turned his horse and rode away without a word. Duff stood in the yard with the broom handle tight in his fist and watched the rider disappear down the trail. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. He would wonder later why he kept it to himself, and the answer was simple and uncomfortable. He was already keeping one secret, the letter from Bozeman, hidden in his drawer, and secrets, once you start collecting them, have a way of breeding. But the hobnailed boots stayed in his memory. And 2 nights later, when he watched his brother Thane slip something into his own boot before coming inside those boots would be the reason Duff decided to look. Day 4, Thane disappeared. He told Bridger he was going to town to deliver the last batch of skinning knives to a buyer in Copper Falls. Rowena heard him say it, and she heard the lie in the same way she heard a crack in an anvil, not through any single wrong note, but through the absence of the right ones. She asked Duff that evening while they were stacking firewood, "Where does your middle brother go all day?" Duff did not look at her. "Selling." "There is nothing to sell. The last order was delivered a week ago." I checked the ledger. Silence. Duff kept stacking. She did not push. She had learned from a lifetime of working with men who did not like being questioned by women. That silence after a hard question was more useful than another question. That night, late after Thane came home smelling of whiskey and wood smoke and something sweeter, something like the perfume they wore in saloons, Duff lay in his bunk and listened to his brother undress in the dark. He heard the soft sound of paper being folded. He heard the creak of leather as something was pushed into a boot. He waited. 20 minutes. 30. Until Thane's breathing went slow and heavy. Then Duff got up. He crossed the cabin floor in bare feet, avoiding the board that creaked near the stove. He reached into Thane's left boot. His fingers found a piece of paper folded into quarters. He carried it to the window where the moonlight was strongest and unfolded it. A promissory note. A line on the forge, signed in Thane's handwriting, countersigned with the stamp of Dex Garrity, Copper Falls. 90-day term. The date told Duff everything he needed to know. The term had expired 2 weeks ago. The forge, the building, the anvil, the tools, the charcoal, all of it, every physical thing that 3 brothers had built in 6 years was collateral on a gambling debt that Thane had already failed to repay. Duff read it twice. His face went white in the moonlight. He refolded the paper. He put it back in the boot. He crossed back to his bunk and lay down and stared at the ceiling until dawn. He did not tell anyone, not because he wanted to protect Thane, because he knew that if he told Bridger, Bridger would want to sell the forge immediately, and Duff was not ready to face the reason Bridger wanted to sell, a reason he could feel pressing against the walls of this cabin, like water behind a dam, a reason that had something to do with spectacles and squinting and hands that trembled over tasks they used to perform without effort. One more secret, in a house that was already full of them. Day 5. Rowena found it too. She was doing laundry. Not because she was the woman and laundry was women's work. She had made a deal. She washed, they cooked. A fair exchange negotiated on day 2 with the same directness she applied to everything. "I am not your wife, your mother, or your maid, but I will wash clothes if someone else handles the food." In Thane's left boot, the promissory note. She unfolded it, read it. Her face did not change expression. Rowena Kilbride was not a woman whose face betrayed surprise. Surprise was a luxury for people who had time to feel it, and she had never had that kind of time. But she noticed something else. The paper had been refolded along a different crease than the original. Thane's fold was vertical into quarters. The current fold was horizontal. Someone had opened this paper, read it, and refolded it incorrectly. Someone with hands that were used to folding things a different way. Someone who was not Thane. She knew without being told that Duff had read it before her. She refolded the paper along the wrong crease, deliberately preserving the evidence of the second reader. She put it back in the boot. She finished the laundry. That evening, the 4 of them sat at the plank table for dinner. Duff had made stew. It was adequate. Thane was telling a story about a man in town who had tried to shoe a mule and gotten kicked into a water trough. He told it well. His hands moved when he talked, painting pictures in the air, and his face was animated and warm and entirely false. Duff was looking at his plate. Not at Thane, not at anyone. His spoon moved in slow circles through the stew without lifting. Rowena was silent. She was rarely silent. She usually had an opinion about the food, the weather, the angle of the sun through the cabin window, or the quality of the firewood. Tonight, nothing. Bridger noticed. Are you all right? She looked at Thane, who was still smiling, still talking, still performing the role of the charming middle brother who made everything lighter. She looked at Duff, who was still stirring soup he was not eating. She looked back at Bridger. I am fine, she said, but the forge is not. Bridger heard a comment about cracked fire bricks. Duff heard a bomb with a lit fuse. Rowena heard herself telling the truth in a way that no one at the table was equipped to receive. And Thane heard nothing at all because Thane had spent 28 years perfecting the art of hearing only what kept his smile in place. Day 6, the Damascus blade. This was the day that changed everything, though none of them knew it yet. This was the day the steel revealed what it was made of, and so did the people holding it. Rowena stood at the anvil with 2 bars of steel laid side by side. High carbon on the left, mild steel on the right. She had prepared them the night before, cutting them to equal length, cleaning the surfaces with a wire brush until the metal shone. Duff stood beside her close enough to see every detail. He had tied his hair back and rolled his sleeves the way she did, and she noticed, and she appreciated the imitation without commenting on it. Imitation in the forge was respect. Bridger stood behind them near the doorway where the light was best. He had positioned himself carefully as he always did now, finding the spot where his failing eyes could gather the most information from the least effort. He adjusted his spectacles twice. Thane sat outside the forge entrance, his back against the stone wall. He was not participating. He did not have the skill. But he was watching. It was the first time Rowena had seen him watch anything for more than 5 minutes without getting up to leave, and she filed that observation in the growing dossier she was building on the middle brother, the one with the smooth hands and the wrong kind of smile. 2 kinds of steel, she said to Duff. She held up the high carbon bar. This one is hard. It holds an edge like a razor. But if you drop it wrong, it snaps. It has no forgiveness. She held up the mild steel. This one is soft. It bends, it absorbs shock. It forgives almost anything. But it will not hold an edge. You cannot cut with mercy alone. Oh, she laid them on top of each other on the anvil. Damascus is what happens when you force these 2 to become one. You heat them until they are ready to change. You fold them together. You hammer them until they stop being 2 things and start being something new. She paused. She was talking about steel. But in the room behind her, 3 brothers stood or sat, each one missing what the others had. Each one too proud or too scared or too stubborn to admit it. One was hard and breaking. One was soft and shapeless. One was something else entirely, something that had not yet decided what it would become. She pushed the stacked bars into the forge. She worked the bellows until the fire roared and the steel began to glow. First black-red, then cherry, then a bright orange that filled the small stone room with pulsing light. 10 folds make 1,000 layers. 20 folds make 1,000,000. Each fold the steel gets stronger. But you have to be patient. Fold it before it is hot enough, it cracks. Fold it when it is too hot, it burns. You have to read the color. She pulled the steel from the fire, laid it on the anvil, raised her father's hammer. Steel does not fold itself. You have to heat it, strike it, fold it, heat it again. She brought the hammer down. The sound rang through the forge, the bright, clean ring of steel being shaped into something it had never been before. She struck again, and again. 10 times 20 each blow, precise each fold, bringing the 2 kinds of steel closer to becoming one. She worked for hours. Duff helped, holding the tongs when she needed both hands, working the bellows when the fire dropped, watching every movement with the hungry attention of a student who was learning the thing he was born to learn. They did not speak. They did not need to. The forge spoke for them in the language of fire and iron and hammered air. When the blade was ready for quenching, Rowena held it up. The steel glowed a deep, even orange. She nodded to Duff, and together they plunged it into the water trough. The sound was a sharp, violent hiss, and a cloud of steam rose to the ceiling and hung there like a ghost. They waited. The steel cooled. The water settled. Duff lifted the blade from the trough and held it up to the light. The Damascus pattern was there. Rippling lines of darker and lighter steel woven through the surface of the blade, like the grain of ancient wood, like rivers seen from a great height, like the currents of two lives flowing into one. It was beautiful. Not pretty, not decorative, not ornamental. Beautiful the way a well-built bridge is beautiful because it works and because the work is visible in every line. Duff looked at Rowena. She nodded. Acceptance. Approval. The small specific recognition that passes between two craftspeople who have made something together that neither could have made alone. Then Bridger stepped forward. He reached for the blade. Duff handed it to him. Bridger held it up, turning it in the firelight, and Rowena watched him the way she had been watching him for 6 days with the patient, accumulating attention of someone who is building a diagnosis one symptom at a time. He turned the blade left, right, tilted it, squinted, brought it closer to his face. Closer, closer still until the tip of the blade was inches from his nose, until his eyes were straining so hard that the lines on his forehead deepened into furrows, until it became obvious that what he was doing was not admiring the blade. He was trying to see the pattern, and he could not. He could not see the Damascus lines, the rippling waves of folded steel, the whole point of the technique, the thing that made a Damascus blade worth 10 times an ordinary knife. The thing that Duff and Rowena had spent an entire day creating with fire and patience and sweat was invisible to him. Rowena watched. Everything she had noticed over 6 days collapsed into a single understanding, the way a long equation resolves into a single number. The squinting, the head tilts, the spectacles he adjusted every few minutes, the way he stood back from the forge never close to the fire, the way he had stopped coming to Elspeth Cork's store, the way the old woman had started delivering supplies and stocking extra candles. Candles he had been buying 3 times the normal amount because he needed 3 times the normal light. Bridger Sutcliffe was going blind. She spoke quietly, low enough that only he could hear. Duff was at the far end of the forge cleaning tools out of earshot. You cannot see the pattern, can you? It was not a question. She did not ask questions when she already knew the answer. Bridger set the blade down on the anvil, carefully, gently, the way a man sets down the last letter from someone who is gone. He did not answer. He turned and walked out of the forge. Duff looked up, saw his eldest brother's back disappearing through the doorway, saw Rowena standing at the anvil with an expression he could not read, an expression that was not pity and was not fear and was not anything he had a word for. It was something closer to recognition. The look one damaged thing gives another when it sees itself reflected. Outside, Bridger leaned against the stone wall of his own forge with his hands flat against the rock. His breath came in short pulls, and his eyes, his failing, dimming, darkening eyes, stared at a mountain range he could barely distinguish from the sky. For 8 months he had hidden this. For 8 months he had stood in this forge and pretended he could still read the steel, could still judge the color of heated iron, could still do the one thing he had spent his entire adult life learning to do. He had compensated, he had adjusted. He had found workarounds and excuses and ways to stand just far enough from the fire that no one could see him straining. And a woman with red hair and a dead man's hammer had seen through all of it in 6 days. He stood there for a long time. The sun went behind the mountains. The shadows grew long. Inside the forge, the fire died down to embers, and the blade that Bridger Sutcliffe could not see the beauty of cooled to room temperature. On the anvil, its Damascus pattern gleaming in the fading light, like a secret written in a language that was slipping day by day beyond his reach. That night, Rowena sat outside the cabin on a stump of Douglas fir and sharpened her father's hammer with a whetstone. Not the head, the edge where the face met the cheek, the transition zone that determined whether a strike landed clean or skidded. It was unnecessary work. The hammer did not need sharpening. But her hands needed to move when her mind was full, and tonight her mind was very full indeed. The door opened behind her. She did not turn around. She knew the sound of Bridger's step by now, the way it landed heavier on the left foot, the slight drag of his right boot on the threshold, the pause he always made in the doorway, while his eyes adjusted to whatever darkness or light waited outside. The pause was longer than it used to be. She had noticed that too. He stepped out. She stood up because Rowena Kilbride did not have difficult conversations while seated. Standing meant she could leave if she needed to, and it meant the other person could leave if they needed to. And both of those exits being available made the conversation honest in a way that sitting down together never could. They stood 3 paces apart. The night was cold. Their breath made small clouds between them, visible for a moment, then gone. No fire between them, no coffee. No warmth exchanged through objects instead of words. Just two people in 3 paces in a sky full of stars that Bridger could not see clearly anymore. "Will you tell my brothers?" he asked. "That is not my job." "Will you stay? I have a 7-day contract, 1 day left." And after 7 days, she stopped the whetstone, looked at him. In the darkness, his face was a collection of planes and shadows, the deep lines around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his mouth held itself in a line that was not quite frowning and not quite resigned, but was something in between that did not have a name. "You have 3 secrets in this house," she said. The words came out flat and level, the way she said everything, but each one carried a weight that the night air seemed to bend around. "Your eyes are 1, the paper in Thane's boot is 2, and the letter from Bozeman in Duff's drawer is 3. Bridger did not move. For a moment, he did not breathe. She watched his face process each piece of information in sequence. The first, his eyes, he already knew. That was his own secret and the one he had been carrying for 8 months like a stone in his chest. But the second, the paper in Thane's boot. His face changed when she said it, the way steel changes color when it crosses the threshold from workable to dangerous. "Thane mortgaged the forge." His voice was low and rough, like a blade being dragged across an uneven surface. "To Dex Garrity, gambling house in Copper Falls, 90-day lien, 2 weeks past due. And Duff? Bozeman Printing Works, a letter of acceptance. He wants to leave." The silence that followed was packed tight with everything Bridger had not known. Everything he had suspected without admitting, everything he had seen in his brother's behavior that he had chosen to explain away because the alternative was too heavy to carry alongside his own secret, and he was already carrying more than his frame could hold. "I do not stay in a house where 3 men hide 3 different things from each other and call it family," Rowena said. She put the whetstone in her pocket. She picked up the hammer. 3 brothers, 3 secrets, 3 different directions. That is not a family. That is 3 people who happen to be in the same place. She walked past him and went inside. She did not touch him. She did not soften her voice. She did not offer comfort or advice or the kind of gentle suggestion that would have allowed him to pretend the conversation had been a discussion rather than a verdict. She left him standing in the cold. Bridger stayed outside for a long time. The temperature dropped. The stars moved. Then he went inside. He walked past his brother's bunks, past Thane sleeping with one arm hanging off the side and Duff lying too still to be genuinely asleep. He knelt beside his own bunk and reached under the frame until his fingers found the envelope from the doctor in Helena. He had put it there 5 months ago and had taken it out 14 times since. He did not read it again. He carried it to the table by the window, the place in the cabin where the morning light was strongest, and he set it down. "A man who hides a letter under his bed is a man who is not ready. A man who puts it on the table is a man who is almost ready." And Bridger Sutcliffe stood in the dark cabin and knew that tomorrow he would have to do the thing he had been afraid to do since the day his right eye stopped being able to distinguish red from white in a forge fire. He would have to tell the truth. Morning came the way it always came in the Bitterroot Range, slowly, reluctantly, as though the sun was not entirely sure the mountains deserved another day. Rowena was packing. She moved through the small space the brothers had cleared for her, near the stove, with the efficient precision of someone who had learned to pack quickly because she had been asked to leave many places on short notice. The apron rolled tight, the whetstone wrapped in cloth, a spare shirt folded flat, and last the hammer which she slid into the bag with the care you would give a sleeping child. 7 days, that was the deal. 7 days were done. She was leaving. She heard Bridger's voice from the other side of the cabin. Low, controlled. The voice of a man who has rehearsed something all night and is now performing it for the first and only time. "Sit down, both of you." She did not sit. She was not invited, and she had not asked to be included. She moved to the door, her packed bag in her hand, and she stood with her back to the room and her face to the yard. But the window beside the door was open, and she heard everything. "I am going blind." 6 words. Bridger said them the way you lay a piece of hot steel on an anvil, deliberately, with full knowledge that what follows will be violent. The doctor in Helena says 1 to 2 years. If I stay near the forge, near the metal fumes, the damage accelerates. I can no longer tell the difference between cherry red steel and white hot steel. I have not been able to for 3 months. Silence. The kind of silence that has a shape that fills a room the way water fills a container, pressing against every surface, finding every crack. I want to sell the forge, pay what we owe, go separate ways. Duff spoke first. His voice was not sad, it was angry. This was the thing about the youngest Sutcliffe that most people did not understand. He was not quiet because he was gentle. He was quiet because he was calculating, and when the calculation was done, what came out was not softness. It was precision. How long have you been hiding this? 8 months. 8 months, the sound of a chair scraping back. Wood on wood. Duff was standing. You let me stay here. You let me forge for you in your place every day for 8 months while you knew. You held me here with guilt and duty, and the forge needs you, Duff, while you were standing 10 feet from the anvil, pretending you could still see the color of heated steel. I kept you here because there was no one else. Duff's voice cracked on the last word, not from tears, but from the specific strain of a truth that has been swallowed too many times. I know, I have always known. That is the problem, Bridger. That has always been the problem. And then Thane. Thane, who had been silent in a way that was not his usual silence, because Thane's usual mode was noise was charm, was the easy smile and the lighter word. This silence had the quality of a man calculating how many seconds he had before the ground beneath him opened up. We are not selling the forge. Bridger turned to him. Why not? Because this is our home. 3 words. They might have been true once, but Thane did not say them like a man defending his home. He said them like a man defending his hiding place. Duff looked at Thane. The youngest brother's eyes were steady and cold. No, we are not selling because you mortgaged it. Thane's face went blank. The face of a man whose cards have just been turned over by someone who was not supposed to be looking at the deck. Duff reached into his pocket and produced the promissory note. He set it on the table beside Bridger's medical letter. Dex Garrity's stamp, Thane's signature. 90 days overdue. I found it last week. After I saw the rider, a man on horseback with hobnailed boots. He stopped outside the forge and looked at it the way a man looks at something he already owns. One of Garrity's people. Duff's voice was shaking, not from fear, from the effort of holding back everything he had been holding back for years. I kept it quiet because I was also hiding something. He reached into his pocket again. A second piece of paper. Different size, different weight. Cream-colored stock with a printed letterhead. Bozeman Printing Works. They offered me a position. Typesetter and engraver. I want to go. I have wanted to go for 2 years. 3 pieces of paper on the table. A medical diagnosis, a gambling debt, a job offer. 3 brothers looking at each other across a surface no wider than a plank of pine, but the distance between them could have swallowed a canyon. Bridger looked at the gambling lien. He had not known. 8 months of hiding his own secret, and he had not seen his brothers, and the irony of a man going blind, who also failed to see, was not lost on him. Thane looked at the medical letter. The words progressive bilateral corneal deterioration swam in front of his eyes, and for the first time in his life, the thing swimming in front of Thane Sutcliffe's eyes was not a card he was trying to read across a poker table, but the face of his eldest brother's future. Duff looked at both of them, and then he looked at the window. 3 brothers, he said. His voice had gone quiet again, but it was a different quiet than before. Not calculated. Exhausted. 3 secrets. And the only person in this house who told the truth was the woman who was packing her bag outside. Outside, Rowena stood with her back to the window and her bag at her feet and her father's hammer pressing against her hip. She had heard every word. She did not go inside. She did not offer commentary or comfort or the kind of intervention that would have made her the hero of this scene, because she was not interested in being anyone's hero. She was interested in being a blacksmith, and blacksmiths do not rescue people. They shape metal. What people do with the metal afterward is their own affair. But she heard Duff's last line, and she recognized in it the sound of a truth that could either break a family apart or fuse it back together depending on what the people inside that room did. in the next 60 seconds. They did nothing. The 60 seconds passed. No one spoke. No one reached across the table. The silence filled the room the way ash fills a cold forge, completely and without mercy. Then Thane moved. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He did not sit down and put his head in his hands and weep the way a man in a story about redemption is supposed to weep when his sins are laid before him. Thane Sutcliffe had one response to being caught in a wrong, and he had been practicing that response his entire life. He ran. "I will fix this," he said, already reaching for his coat on the hook by the door. "I will go find Garrity." Bridger's voice followed him. "Fix it, Hal. Play more cards." "What do you want me to do? Get on my knees and beg." "I want you to stay." The word hit Thane like a hammer strike on cold steel. Stay. 4 letters. The simplest word in the language, and the hardest one for a man whose entire survival strategy was built on leaving. "Stay for what?" Thane's voice rose, not in anger, in the specific panic of a man who has been seen. "To watch you go blind, to watch Duff hate me a little more every day, to have that woman look at me the way she has looked at me since the first time she checked my hands and found nothing there. The way she read you," Bridger said quietly, "on the first day, before any of us." Thane's jaw tightened. He pulled his coat from the hook. He walked toward the door. On his way, he passed the workbench. The Damascus blade lay there, the blade Rowena and Duff had forged the day before. It caught the morning light, and the folded steel pattern rippled across its surface like water over stone. Thane stopped. He looked at the blade. He reached out and touched it, running one finger along the flat of the steel, tracing the Damascus lines the way a man traces the lines on a map of a place he is leaving. Then he pulled his hand back. He curled his fingers into his palm and walked out the door. Rowena was standing in the yard, bag at her feet, hammer on her hip. "Where are you going?" she asked. "None of your concern." "The forge you mortgaged is where I work. It is very much my concern." He stopped, turned. For the first time since she had arrived, Thane Sutcliffe looked at her without smiling. The mask was gone. What was behind it was not ugly, not cruel, not the face of a villain or a coward. It was the face of a man who was tired of pretending and who did not know how to be anything else. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want you to stop walking long enough to hear what your brother just said. He said, I want you to stay." Bridger does not ask people to stay. He does not ask people for anything. He carries and he carries until his back breaks, and tonight he asked you for one thing, and you are walking away from it. Thane looked at her. His eyes were red not from crying, but from the strain of not crying. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Whatever he had been about to say dissolved before it reached the air. He turned. He walked down the trail. He did not look back. Rowena watched him go. She did not follow. She did not call after him. She respected a person's right to make their own choices even when those choices were wrong. Especially when those choices were wrong. You could not force steel to fold before it was ready. If you tried, it cracked. She picked up her bag. She looked at the cabin. Then she set the bag down. She sat on the stump. She picked up the whetstone, and she waited. Thane did not come back that day or the next. No word, no letter, no message sent through a passing rider or a note left at Elspeth Cork's store. He simply vanished down the mountain trail and into the network of back roads and saloon towns that had swallowed his time and his money and his self-respect for the better part of 2 years. Rowena stayed, not because of the 7-day contract which had expired, not because of Bridger or Duff or the Damascus blade cooling on the workbench. She stayed because she needed the work, and no other forge in the territory would hire a woman, and the alternative to staying was going back to Pennsylvania with nothing. She stayed and she forged, and she taught Duff the finer points of Damascus technique, and she and Bridger did not speak about the night outside the cabin or about the 3 secrets that were no longer secrets, but were not yet resolved because saying a truth out loud and dealing with it are 2 different activities, and the Sutcliffe brothers were better at the first than the second. Weeks passed. The forge operated at half capacity. Bridger stayed away from the hearth, finding reasons to work on handles and sheaths and packaging tasks that did not require him to read the color of heated steel. Duff forged in silence, producing competent blades without the Damascus technique that required a second pair of hands. Nobody mentioned Thane. His bunk stayed made. His boots, the ones Rowena had found the promissory note in, sat by the door where he had left them, accumulating a thin layer of dust that Duff noticed and did not wipe away. And then on the night that Rowena decided to leave for real, to actually pick up her bag and her hammer and walk down the mountain and find some other life in some other place, the forge burned. The story has circled back to where it began. The fire, the three men in the yard, the woman with the bucket. But now the watching carries different weight, because now you know what each of those men was hiding, and you know that the woman was the only one among them who had said the hard things out loud. And you know that 3 seconds of hesitation from a man with smooth hands and a gambling debt is not the pause of a guilty conscience, but the pause of a man calculating whether the fire was set by the brother he betrayed or by the creditor he owed. They fought the fire until dawn, and they lost, and in the morning they sat on the log with the cracked coffee pot and the silence that comes after the end of things. But the fire was not the end. It was the fold. The part where the steel is heated past its comfort, where the hammer falls and the metal screams, and the layers that were separate were forced together into something that will either hold or shatter. Inside the minds of the two brothers, still present suspicion was doing what suspicion does in small spaces, growing. Bridger thought Thane had come back in the night and set the fire out of rage. Thane knew where the weak points in the forge were, Thane had reason to want it gone. Duff thought Bridger had done it himself. Bridger wanted to sell. An accidental fire would produce insurance money. A man going blind might see the logic in burning down the thing he could no longer use. And Thane, who was absent, became the default suspect because the absent are always the easiest to blame. Each brother looked at the other across the ashes and saw not a brother, but a possible arsonist. And the distance between those two things was the distance the fire had really burned. Rowena let them sit with it for one night. She let the suspicions settle into their bones the way cold settles into a cabin without a fire. She did this not because she was cruel, but because she knew that the only thing more powerful than being told the truth was discovering it yourself, and she wanted them to feel the full weight of what it meant to suspect each other before she took that weight away. The next morning, she placed her father's hammer on the makeshift table they had assembled from a scorched plank and 2 stumps. The hammer sat there like a judge's gavel, 3.5 pounds of forged steel on a handle shaped by a dead man's palm. It had survived 2 fires now, the one that had taken her father's forge in Pennsylvania and the one that had taken the Sutcliffe Forge in Montana. "This is the only thing I saved last night," she said. "Not because it is valuable, because my father taught me that a tool is the person who holds it. This hammer is my father. That forge was your family." She paused. She looked at them both one at a time, the way a smith examines 2 pieces of steel before deciding whether they can be joined. "But I do not forge for people who do not trust each other." The words hung in the cold air. A house full of secrets is not a home. It is a waiting room. And I have spent my whole life in waiting rooms, and I am done. She let the words settle. Then she continued, "I will stay and rebuild this forge, but only if you rebuild the trust first, because a forge without trust is just a pile of rocks in a hole for fire, and I have already walked away from one of those." Bridger started to speak, but she was not finished. "And I will tell you something else. No one in this house set that fire." She pointed to the ground near the foundation. The hobnailed boot prints were still there, preserved in the mud. Those prints, hobnailed boots, size 12, miner's issue. No one here wears those boots. She looked at Duff. "You saw the rider, day 3, same kind of boots." Duff nodded slowly. His face changed as the connection formed, as the suspicion he had been carrying about Bridger released its grip and was replaced by a different understanding. "Garrity Peptem," he said. The name came out quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of a verdict. Bridger looked at his youngest brother. Duff looked back, and for the first time since the secrets had broken open, the 2 brothers looked at each other without suspicion. Not with warmth, not yet. The damage was too fresh for warmth. But without the specific corrosive doubt that makes a brother look at a brother and wonder if the person across the table is also the person who struck the match. Bridger closed his eyes. When he opened them, his hand found Duff's forearm across the table. He gripped it. Not a handshake, not an embrace. The grip of a man steadying himself against something that might otherwise pull him under. Rowena watched them. She did not join. She did not make it a circle. She let it be what it was. Two brothers in the ashes of their home finding one small piece of solid ground. Then she picked up her hammer. She hooked it back onto her belt. "Build the trust," she said. "I will build the forge." She turned and walked toward the ruins, and she started clearing rubble, and the sound of her work, the scrape of stone on stone, the thud of charred timber being dragged and stacked became the first new sound in a silence that had lasted too long. 5 days without the sound of a hammer on steel. Not 5 days without noise. There was plenty of noise. The scrape of a shovel clearing ash. The crack of a charred beam being broken down for disposal. The thud of new fire bricks being stacked in rows along the foundation line, each one carried up the mountain trail by hand, because the mule cart had burned with the forge and nobody had money to replace it. But no hammer on steel. No ring of iron meeting iron. No song from the anvil which sat in the center of the ruins like a monument to something that no longer existed. The silence of a forge without fire is a particular kind of silence. It is the silence of a church without a congregation, a kitchen without the smell of bread. It is the silence of a place that was built for sound, and when that sound is absent, the silence is not empty. It is full of everything the sound used to carry. Bridger and Duff worked side by side. They did not speak more than necessary. They passed bricks and held beams and measured angles with the wordless coordination of two men who had spent years occupying the same space. But the coordination was mechanical now. The instinct was still there, but the warmth behind it had been stripped away by 3 pieces of paper on a table, and what remained was competence without connection, the way a well-made knife can still cut even after the handle has broken off. Rowena directed. She measured the new foundation with a length of cord and a plumb weight. She calculated the angle for the flue this time correct, and she marked the positions for the fire bricks with charcoal X's on the stone foundation. She worked harder than either of them, not because she was trying to prove something, but because working hard was the only mode she had, the only gear her body understood. On the 5th day, the rain came. It had been threatening all morning, a low ceiling of gray cloud pressed down against the mountains like a hand holding a lid on a pot. By noon, the first drops fell fat and cold, and by early afternoon, the rain was steady, and the trail up the mountain was running with brown water, and the new mortar between the fire bricks was at risk of washing out before it set. They covered the foundation with canvas. They stood under the partial shelter of the cabin's eave and watched the rain fall on the ruins of their old life and the beginnings of their new one. Then Duff looked up the trail. A figure was walking toward them through the rain. Not riding, walking. His horse was behind him, being led by the reins, its head down against the weather. The man was soaked. His coat was dark with water plastered to his shoulders. His hair hung in his face. He was thinner than he had been 2 weeks ago, the kind of thin that comes from not eating regularly, the kind that shows first in the jaw and the hollows beneath the cheekbones. Thane Sutcliffe stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the place where the forge had been. He had left it standing. He was returning to ash. The rain ran down his face and dripped from his chin, and he did not wipe it away, and the 3 people standing under the eave watched him with 3 different expressions that contained 3 different versions of the same complicated thing. Thane spoke. His voice was rough, abraded by 2 weeks of disuse and weather and whatever else he had put it through in the saloons and back roads between here and Copper Falls. I went to find Garrity. 1 sentence. It sat in the rain between them and waited for a response. Bridger gave it. And Thane reached into the inside pocket of his coat. His hand came out holding pieces of paper. Torn pieces. 4 of them ragged-edged, damp but legible. He held them out and the rain hit them and made the ink run slightly at the edges, but the signature was still visible, and the stamp of Dex Garrity's gambling house was still visible, and the word Leon was still visible, broken across 2 pieces where the tear had gone through it. I played one last hand, Thane said. I lost on purpose. He paused. The rain filled the pause completely. I have played Garrity for 2 years. I know his tells. I know when he is winning fair and when he is winning by reaching into his sleeve. He keeps a king of spades in his left cuff. He uses it when the pot is large enough to justify the risk. I have seen him do it 11 times. I never called it because calling it would have meant admitting I was in the game, and admitting I was in the game would have meant explaining why. His voice steadied as he spoke the way a hand steadies when it finds something to grip. I set it up. I sat down at his table on a Thursday night when the saloon was full. I made sure the marshal was in the room. I bought him a drink and seated him at the next table where he had a clear line of sight. I played four hands clean, losing small, building the pot. On the fifth hand, I went all in. I pushed everything I did not have across the table, and I watched Garrity's left hand drop below the edge, and I waited. Thane's eyes were red, not from the rain. He pulled the king from his cuff. In front of four witnesses and a federal marshal who was 2 drinks into a bottle of rye and looking for something to justify his salary. Silence except for the rain. Garrity was arrested on the spot. The lien was voided by the Copper Falls magistrate the next morning. You cannot enforce a contract signed on the basis of fraudulent gambling transactions. The judge used those exact words. Thane stopped. He swallowed. The muscles in his throat worked visibly, and for a moment he looked like a man trying to swallow something much larger than saliva. I am not good at forging. I am not good at anything except cards. So I use the only thing I am good at to fix the only thing I broke. The yard was quiet. The rain continued. The horse behind Thane shifted its weight and stood there the way horses stand in rain, patient and resigned. Bridger moved first. He stepped out from under the eave. Into the rain. He did not hurry. He walked away. He did everything now carefully because a man whose vision is failing learns to be deliberate with every step. He crossed the yard to where Thane stood. He did not embrace his brother. He did not weep. He did not say the words, "I forgive you," or "welcome home," or any of the phrases that a moment like this is supposed to require. He reached out and took the torn pieces of paper from Thane's hand. He held them close to his face and he tried to read them, and he could not because the rain in his eyes conspired against the ink. It did not matter. He knew what they were. He walked to the foundation of the old forge where the ash was now a gray paste in the rain, and he knelt and he placed the torn pieces of the promissory note into the ash. The rain soaked them instantly. The ink bled. The paper softened and began to dissolve, and within minutes the lien that had mortgaged 6 years of 3 brothers' work became indistinguishable from the ash of the forge it had nearly destroyed. Debt into ash, ash into mud, mud into the mountain, gone. Thane walked to the workbench. The temporary one, the scorched plank on 2 stumps. The Damascus blade was there, the blade Rowena had saved from the fire. The blade Thane had touched once on the day he left, running his finger along the steel before pulling away. He reached into his pocket. He took out the last torn piece of the promissory note, the piece with his own signature on it, and he laid it on the bench beside the knife. And he put his hand flat on the wood next to the blade, and he did not pull it back. The last time he had stood at this bench, he had touched the steel and withdrawn. He had chosen to leave. This time, he chose to stay. The hand on the table was the opposite of the hand pulled back, and the difference between the two was everything. Rowena watched from the eave. Duff watched from beside her. Neither spoke. Then Duff said quietly the words he had heard Rowena speak 6 days ago in the forge. The words about 2 kinds of steel and patience and heat, and the thing that happens when separate layers are forced together under pressure. Steel does not fold itself, but once it folds, it never breaks along the same line. The rain kept falling. The 4 of them stood in the yard, wet, cold, surrounded by rubble, and the beginnings of something new, and the moment did not feel like a resolution. It felt like a fold. The next day they rebuilt, not just the forge, the way they worked together. The arrangement of bodies and tasks and responsibilities that had been wrong for years, built on secrets and assumptions, and the stubborn refusal to admit that the roles assigned at the beginning were no longer the roles that fit. Bridger did not stand near the hearth. He stood at the new foundation wall laying bricks. Mortar work did not require sharp vision. It required steady hands and a sense of level, and his hands, though they trembled, knew the feel of plumb. Thane carried. He hauled timber and stone and sacks of charcoal up the trail from the supply cache at the bottom of the mountain, making trip after trip with the silent, grinding determination of a man who is trying to repay a debt that cannot be measured in currency. He did not complain. He did not charm. He just carried. And by the end of the first day, his shoulders ached and his palms were raw, and the first faint suggestions of calluses appeared on the heels of his hands, where the rope had rubbed against skin that had never been asked to do this kind of work before. Duff designed. He sketched the new forge layout on paper, incorporating all of Rowena's corrections: the straight flue, the reinforced anvil base, the ventilation channels. His drawings were precise and beautiful, the work of a man whose real talent was not forging, but designing. Rowena directed. She stood at the center of the worksite like the hub of a wheel, and the three brothers moved around her in orbits that she controlled with a word, a gesture, a pointed finger. She was not gentle about it. She said, "Move that beam 2 inches left." And she meant 2 inches left, and if the beam was 2.5 inches left, she said ½ inch back, and that was all. In the early afternoon, a cart appeared at the bottom of the trail. Elspeth Cork drove it herself, a small woman on a large cart pulled by a mule that looked as old and stubborn and reliable as its owner. The cart was loaded with supplies: fire bricks, fire clay, a sack of oak charcoal, a crate of candles, bread, salt pork, and a jar of pickled beets that nobody had asked for, but that Mrs. Cork had included because she believed pickled beets solved most problems, and the ones they did not solve were probably not worth solving anyway. She climbed down from the cart. She picked up a sack of fire clay and carried it to the foundation with the calm authority of a woman who had been carrying things all her life. Then she reached into a box behind the cart seat and pulled out a package wrapped in brown paper. Candles, not the thin tapers she stocked in her store. Thick pillar candles, the kind that burned for hours, the kind that threw enough light to read, by the kind a man with failing eyes would need to navigate a cabin after dark. She carried them to where Bridger was laying bricks. She set them on the ground beside him. "I brought extra candles," she said. Her voice was dry and factual, the voice of a woman who sold goods for a living and had long ago learned that the best way to help someone was to allow them what they needed without making them ask for it. "The tall ones, I know you need them." Bridger looked up. His mortar-covered hands went still on the brick he was setting. He looked at the old woman, and in her face he saw something he had not expected: knowledge. She knew. She had known for a long time. She had known from the candles, from the way he stopped coming to her store, from the way he squinted when she delivered supplies. She had known, and she had not told anyone, and she had not pitied him, and she had not offered help in any way that would have required him to acknowledge what was happening. She had simply started delivering supplies to the mountain instead of waiting for him to come down, and she had stocked extra candles, and she had done all of this in silence because Elspeth Cork understood that there is a kind of helping that does not need to announce itself. "Thank you, Elspeth," he said, and in those two words was everything else he could not say. She nodded once, turned, went back to the cart for another load. That afternoon, while the four of them were eating bread and salt pork in the unfinished shell of the new forge, Bridger spoke. He spoke to everyone this time, not in the dark, not behind closed doors, not in a careful, measured confession. This time he spoke the way a man speaks when he has made a decision and is announcing it rather than requesting permission. "The doctor says if I stay away from the forge fumes, the deterioration slows. It does not stop, but it slows. I may keep partial sight for 5 years instead of 2. Duff set down his bread. "Then what do you do?" Bridger looked at Rowena. She was examining a fire brick, turning it in her hands, checking for cracks. She did not look up, but she was listening. "I sell," Bridger said, "not the forge, the knives. I know every buyer from Helena to Missoula. I know who pays fair and who pays late and who orders custom and who buys stock. I have been selling Sutcliffe blades for 6 years. I can sell them without seeing them." He looked at Thane, and Thane goes with me. He knows every trail in 200 miles. He knows the shortcuts of the river crossings, the places to camp. Thane was sitting on an overturned bucket, his hands hanging between his knees. He looked up, and his face held something new. Not the charming mask, not the raw shame. Something in between that might, with time and work, become the face of a man who had found a use for himself that did not require a deck of cards. "I know every buyer's preference," Thane said slowly. "Hanson and Helena like 6-inch blades with bone handles. The Trapper Consortium in Deer Lodge wants skinning knives thin and flexible. And the general store in Missoula marks up 40%, so we should sell direct to the outfitters instead." It was the first useful thing Thane Sutcliffe had said in this entire story. The first time he had applied his knowledge of people and places and commerce to something other than finding the next card game. Bridger nodded. Duff forges. Rowena teaches Damascus. I sell. Thane travels. He paused. I am not quitting. I am changing where I stand. The sentence landed in the half-built forge like a hammer strike on a cold anvil, clear and sharp and final. Not quitting, changing position. The way a smith moves from the fire to the anvil to the quenching trough, each station part of the same process, each position necessary, none of them lesser. Rowena looked up from her fire brick. She looked at Bridger Sutcliffe, a man who was going blind and who had just reorganized his entire life around that fact without self-pity and without surrender. And something shifted inside her chest, something that moved the way steel moves when it crosses the critical temperature, the point where it becomes malleable, the point where it can be shaped into something it has never been before. She did not say anything. She went back to defining the fire brick. But she stayed. That night, the new forge was not finished, but the foundation was solid, and the first course of bricks was laid, and the framework for the flue was standing straight, truly straight, measured and leveled, and double-checked by a woman who did not accept approximation in anything she built. Rowena sat on the ground beside the new foundation, her hand on the bricks, feeling the mortar joints with her fingertips. The mortar was still wet. She was checking whether it was setting evenly, because uneven mortar meant uneven stress, and uneven stress meant cracks, and cracks in a forge foundation meant failure, and failure in a forge meant fire. And fire was how this story had started, and she was not going to let it be how this story ended. Bridger came to where she was sitting. He stood nearby, not too close. The distance between them had been established on the night outside the cabin when she had told him his 3 secrets, and it had remained constant since then, a buffer zone of about 3 paces that neither of them had crossed. You stayed, he said. I stayed because this forge needs me. Only the forge. She looked up at him. The firelight from the cabin window behind him turned his outline into a silhouette, a tall shape with shoulders that had carried too much for too long, a shape that was losing its sharpness around the edges, the way a blade loses its edge with use, not suddenly but gradually, until one day you try to cut with it and realize it has gone dull. And for the first time in this story, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, Rowena Kilbride did not have a ready answer. The words that usually came to her mouth, the direct statements and blunt assessments and undecorated facts, did not come. They stalled somewhere between her chest and her throat, caught in the unfamiliar territory of a feeling she had not made room for. She was not good at this. She was good at steel. She was good at fire. She was good at reading the color of heated metal and knowing the exact moment to strike. She was good at hard things, at things that required force and precision and the willingness to stand in front of an open furnace and not flinch. But this, a man standing 3 paces away asking a question that was not about forging. This was a different kind of heat, and she did not have a gauge for it. I stayed because you are the first person who watched me pick up a hammer and did not ask why a woman was forging. You just asked if I was good. It was not a declaration. It was not poetry. It was a fact stated the way she stated all facts, plainly and without decoration. But it was the truest thing she had said. And the fact that it was the truest thing made it the most frightening thing, because true things once spoken cannot be taken back, or refolded, or quenched in water and reshaped. They hold their form forever. Bridger reached out. His hand was trembling, the constant low tremor that had been his companion for months, and it found her hand on the brick. His fingers were rough with mortar and scarred by old burns, and her fingers were calloused and hard and blunt at the tips, and neither hand was soft, and neither hand was delicate, and neither hand belonged to a person who used touch as a casual form of communication. She did not pull away. 2 hands on new brick, one shaking with a disease that was taking his sight, one hardened by a craft that was her only inheritance. The mortar beneath their fingers was still wet, still setting, still in the process of becoming the thing that would hold the forge together. That was all. No kiss, no embrace, no whispered promise. 2 hands on a brick in the dark on a mountain, in a territory that had not yet decided whether it was wilderness or home. Then she withdrew her hand and she stood up, and she walked into the cabin without looking back. And Bridger stood there beside the forge. He could not see clearly anymore, and pressed his palm flat against the brick where her hand had been, and the mortar was cool against his skin, and his eyes burned with something that was not the disease and not the wind. In the morning, Duff was sitting at the table with a piece of paper in his hand. Rowena came in from outside and saw the paper and recognized the letterhead. Bozeman Printing Works, the cream-colored stock, the letter that had been one of 3 secrets on a table. He was reading it again, not with anguish, with the calm, focused attention of a man who was making a calculation. She sat down across from him. She did not ask. She waited. Duff would speak when his calculation was finished. He looked up. "You think I should go?" "I think you should choose," she said. "Stay because you feel guilty, not leave because you are angry. Choose." He folded the letter. He looked out the window. Outside, Bridger and Thane were lifting a timber beam into position on the new forge frame. Together, the two of them working the same piece of wood, Bridger on one end and Thane on the other, communicating through the weight and the angle and the resistance of the timber rather than through words. It was the first time in this story that the 2 older brothers had performed a physical task in coordination without Duff between them acting as translator and buffer and mediator. They did not need him in the middle, not for this, maybe not for anything anymore. "I will write to Bozeman," Duff said. "I will ask them to hold the position for 1 year. I will stay until the forge is rebuilt and the Damascus technique is established. I will teach Thane the basic skills. He has hands. Not forge hands, not yet. But he has hands, and he is not stupid, and if he can learn to read a poker table, he can learn to read the color of heated steel." He paused. Something in his face settled the way sediment settles in water when the current stops revealing the bottom clearly for the first time. "Then I will go." Rowena nodded. "That is a choice, not an obligation." Duff looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived at the Sutcliffe Forge, the youngest brother smiled. Not a calculated smile, not a diplomatic smile, a real smile. The smile of a man who has been given permission to want what he wants by someone who has no stake in whether he stays or goes. "You know something," he said. "You are the most difficult person I have ever met." She almost smiled back. The corner of her mouth moved half an inch and then stopped, which for Rowena Kilbride was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "I hear that often," she said, "but you are right more than anyone else." She picked up her hammer. She stood up. She walked toward the door. "That," she said over her shoulder, "I hear less often." The forge was finished on a Tuesday, not a grand Tuesday, not a Tuesday marked by ceremony or any particular awareness that this day was different from the ones preceding it. It was simply the day when the last brick was set and the last joint was mortared and the flue was sealed and the bellows were mounted and the anvil was moved from the yard back into the building where it belonged. The anvil was the last thing in. It took all 4 of them to move it because an anvil weighs what memory weighs, which is to say far more than its physical mass would suggest. They used rollers, and they pushed and pulled and levered the 200-pound block of iron across the floor and onto the base that Duff had designed and Bridger had built and Rowena had inspected twice. When it was in place, the 4 of them stood around it, breathing hard, looking at the forge they had built together. It was smaller than the old one. The stone was lighter, the timber newer, the proportions slightly different. The flue was straight, the ventilation was correct. The whole structure had the particular quality of something built by people who had learned from previous mistakes, which is the only kind of building that lasts. Rowena placed her father's hammer on the anvil. The 4th time. The last time. And this time, instead of survival or teaching or principles, the hammer on the anvil meant something simpler and larger than any of those things. It meant we are here, we have built this. This is where the work happens. She picked up the hammer. She looked at the 3 brothers. 2 kinds of steel, she said. The first blade Duff and I forged together. 2 people. 2 types of steel. The pattern was clean, even symmetrical. Perfect. She held the hammer out, not to anyone in particular, but to the room. This one 4-people forge, 4 rhythms, 4 different hands. Bridger picked up the tongs. His grip was secure. Tongs required feel, not sight. He could hold steel in the fire by temperature alone, judging the heat through the vibration of the metal, through the resistance in the tongs, through the subtle shift in the sound the fire made when the steel reached the right point. He did not need to see the color. He had been a smith long enough to hear it. Thane picked up the charcoal shovel, the simplest task, the most basic contribution, the equivalent of a musician playing a single note while the rest of the orchestra carried the melody. But it was his note, and he played it, and the fact that he was there to play it at all was the thing that mattered. Duff picked up the small precision hammer, the one he used for detail work, the one that turned a blade from functional to beautiful. His hands were steady. His eyes were clear. He was here for one more year, and the clarity of that timeline freed him to be fully present in a way that the old open-ended obligation never had. Rowena raised her father's hammer. "Steel does not fold itself," she said. And this time the words were not instruction and were not metaphor. They were an invocation. She pushed the steel into the fire. Bridger held it. Thane fed the charcoal. The fire built, and the metal began to glow, and the forge filled with the familiar heat and light and smell that had been absent for weeks, the smell of hot iron and burning oak and the particular sharp scent of steel, crossing the threshold from solid to malleable, the moment where the metal gives up its resistance and agrees to become something new. Rowena called the rhythm. Heat, strike, fold, heat. She brought the hammer down. The sound rang through the forge, the first real hammer strike in weeks, the first note of a song that had been interrupted and was now resuming. Duff followed with the detail hammer, a lighter, faster strike that shaped what Rowena's heavier blow had moved. But now there were other hands. Bridger turned the steel and the tongs at exactly the right moment, feeding the metal back into the fire for reheating. And his timing was perfect, even though he could not see the color, because he could feel the resistance change when the steel cooled past forging temperature. Thane worked the bellows when the fire dropped, and his arms were clumsy, and his rhythm was off, but he adjusted and he learned, and by the fifth fold his bellows work was adequate, and by the 10th it was competent, and the fire held steady. 4 people, 4 rhythms. At first they clashed the way 4 musicians who have never played together clash on the first rehearsal, each one slightly ahead or behind. But Rowena called this beat, and one by one they found it, and by the 15th fold the forge was producing a sound that none of them had heard before. Not perfect, not the clean 2-part rhythm of Rowena and Duff working alone. This was messier, more complex, with undertones and overtones and the occasional missed beat that made the whole thing stumble before recovering. It was the sound of 4 people learning to trust each other with fire. The blade cooled in the quenching trough. The hiss, the steam, the silence that follows. Duff lifted it out. The Damascus pattern was different. The first blade's pattern had been elegant, symmetrical, the waves flowing in parallel, like water over smooth stone. This blade's pattern was wild. The waves crossed and collided and separated and merged again, creating eddies and whirls and unexpected confluences of dark and light steel. It was not orderly. It was not predictable. It was beautiful the way a mountain is beautiful, not because it is symmetrical, but because it is real. Rowena held the blade up. She turned it in the firelight. The first blade I forged with 2 hands and 2 steels. It was precise. It was clean. But it was only 2 voices. She held the new blade next to the memory of the old one. This blade has 4 voices. The pattern is not even. It never will be. But it has something the first blade did not have. She handed it to Bridger. He took it. He did not hold it up to the light. He did not tilt it or squint or bring it close to his failing eyes. He had learned in the weeks since his secret had come out that there were other ways to see. He closed his eyes. He ran his thumb along the flat of the blade slowly from heel to tip. His thumb, calloused and scarred and trembling slightly, traced the Damascus pattern, the way a man reads a page he cannot see. He felt every wave, every fold, every place where Rowena's hammer had shaped the steel, and Duff's detail work had refined it, and his own tongs had turned it, and Thane's fire had heated it. 4 contributions, 4 signatures, all of them readable by touch. Beautiful, he said. Rowena watched him. She watched a man who had spent 8 months hiding the loss of his sight choose in this moment to replace sight with touch and find in the replacement something that was not lesser. Different, but not lesser. You cannot see it, she said. Not a challenge, a fact. Bridger opened his eyes. He looked at her across the blade, across the space between a man losing one sense and a woman who had taught him that another sense could carry the weight. I can feel it, he said. That is enough. 3 words, that is enough. They are not poetic words. They are not the kind of words that get carved into stone or repeated in ceremonies. They are plain words, working words, the kind of words a smith uses when a blade meets specification, when the steel holds its edge, when the heat is right and the fold is clean, and the thing in your hands is finally what it was meant to be. But in that forge between those two people on that day, those 3 words carried everything. A year passed. Not quickly and not easily. A year in the Bitterroot Range is measured in snowfall and mud, and the slow greening of the valleys in spring, and the sharp, bright days of summer, when the light comes in at an angle that makes even ordinary things look like they are made of gold. The forge stood, new stone, new timber straight flew. Smoke rose from it every morning and did not stop rising until evening, and the smoke was clean and gray, and smelled of oak charcoal instead of the acrid bitumenite that Thane had once bought because it was cheaper. The sign above the door was new, not painted, carved. Duff had carved it, spending 3 evenings with a chisel and a mallet, cutting the letters into a plank of aged oak with the same precision he brought to his blade designs. Sutcliffe and Kilbride. Inside the forge, the work continued. Rowena stood at the anvil, her father's hammer in her hand, forging a Damascus blade with the speed and confidence of someone who had been doing this her entire adult life. Beside her, not Duff this time, but Thane. The middle brother held a piece of practiced steel, and Duff stood on the other side, guiding Thane's strikes, adjusting his angle, showing him where the hammer needed to land. Thane's technique was poor. His strikes were uncertain, and his arms tired faster than a trained smith's arms should. But he was there, he was holding a hammer. And on the heels of his palms, where 2 years ago there had been nothing but the smooth skin of a card player, there were calluses. New calluses, thin and tender, the kind that would thicken with time and work. He would never be a master smith. Everyone knew that, but he could learn enough to be useful. And on the days when he was not forging, he was doing what he did best, traveling. He drove the wagon to Helena in Missoula and the small towns in between, carrying crates of finished blades because Bridger's eyes could no longer judge the road well enough to handle the reins. Thane drove. Bridger sold. And the people who bought Sutcliffe and Kilbride blades did not know that the man with the spectacles and the firm handshake could barely see their faces. They knew only that he knew their names and their preferences and the exact blade weight they had ordered last time because Bridger Sutcliffe had committed every customer to memory, and memory did not require eyes. Bridger sat at a table near the forge door in the spot where the light was strongest. He was not forging, he would never forge again. But he was working. In front of him, a finished blade. He did not hold it to the light. He ran his thumb along the edge, feeling for burrs. He pressed the flat against his palm, testing the flex. He tapped the spine with his fingernail and listened to the ring, the clear, high note that told him the tempering was correct. His fingers trembled. They always trembled now. But the trembling had become part of his technique rather than an obstacle to it. He had learned to use the vibration the way a tuning fork uses vibration, as a source of information rather than interference. His quality control was, if anything, more rigorous than when he could see, because a man who checks by touch must check twice. On the shelf behind him, candles burned. The thick pillar candles that Elspeth Cork brought up the mountain every 2 weeks, along with flour and salt, and the pickled beets that no one ate but that she continued to supply because stopping would have meant acknowledging she had been wrong about pickled beets, and Elspeth Cork had never been wrong about anything in 60 years and was not about to start. Duff would leave in the spring. He had written to Bozeman, and they had held the position, and when the snow melted, he would pack his sketches and his ink and his small, precise hammer, and he would walk down the mountain and board a coach and go to a city where he would learn to set type and engrave plates and do the kind of detailed creative work that his hands had been built for. He would miss the forge. He would not miss being needed in a way that felt like a trap. And the difference between missing a place and missing the obligation to stay in that place was the difference between love and duty, and Duff Sutcliffe, at 23 now, had finally learned to tell them apart. But the spring had not come yet. The snow was still on the upper peaks, the trail was still muddy. The mornings were still cold enough that the water in the quenching trough had a skin of ice that had to be broken before the first blade could be tempered. And in the forge, 4 people were still working together, still finding their rhythm, still folding the steel of their shared life into something that had not existed before. So Duff stayed. For now, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, because he chose to. Because the forge was warm and the work was good, and his brothers were learning to be different people, and he wanted to see what those different people would become before he went away to become a different person himself. Elspeth Cork came up the trail in her mule cart on a cold morning in late February. She pulled up to the forge. She picked up the crate of finished blades that was waiting for her. 12 Damascus knives, each one marked with the Sutcliffe and Kilbride stamp. Each one worth more than the last batch because word was spreading, and a Damascus blade from the Bitterroot range was becoming the kind of thing that men asked for by name. She set the crate in her cart. She looked at the sign above the door one more time. Sutcliffe and Kilbride, she said quietly to no one in particular, or perhaps to the mountain, or perhaps to the memory of her own husband, who had died in this range 20 years ago. That sounds like a forge that will stand for 60 more years. She climbed onto the cart. The mole started down the trail without being told because it had made this trip often enough to know the way. Inside the forge, the hammer fell. 4 rhythms: Rowena's heavy, steady beat, Duff's lighter, faster precision, Thane's uncertain learning strikes that were growing less uncertain by the week, and Bridger's hands on the tongs, turning the steel in the fire by feel alone, finding the right moment without sight, trusting his fingers and his instinct in the muscle memory of a lifetime spent shaping metal. The sound was not perfect. It would never be perfect. It had too many voices, too many tempos, too many individual rhythms trying to synchronize into something larger than any of them. It stumbled sometimes. It missed a beat. It recovered and found itself, and stumbled again, and recovered again, the way any living thing stumbles and recovers on its way to becoming what it is. But it was the sound of a forge with people in it. And after 5 days of silence, and 3 weeks of building, and a year of learning to be a different kind of family, the sound of a hammer on steel was the closest thing to music that any of them needed. The last image is not a wedding. It is not a declaration. It is not a sunset or a wide shot of land that stretches to the edge of the frame. The last image is the forge, smoke rising from a straight flue, 4 people inside. The sound of hammers, plural, hitting steel at slightly different intervals, creating a rhythm that is complicated and imperfect and alive. And underneath the hammering, underneath the hiss of steam and the roar of the fire and the steady breathing of 4 people working hard in a small stone room on a mountain in Montana, you can hear the thing that holds it all together. Not love exactly, not yet. Something before love, something sturdier and less decorative. The sound of people who have broken each other's trust and rebuilt it, who have hidden things and revealed them, who have left and come back, who have folded and been folded, and come out stronger along the lines where they almost broke. The sound of steel folding.